Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a world that somehow managed to smell like mud, smoke, and regret all at the same time. A world where life was hard, baths were optional, and your job could literally kill you before your 30th birthday. Yeah, we're talking about the Middle Ages, the time of knights, castles, and a stunning lack of dental hygiene. So, get cozy, dim the lights, and let's drift slowly into the grime and misery that was medieval employment. See, in modern times, we complain about work stress, long commutes, or maybe an annoying boss. But in medieval Europe, your job could involve boiling animal fat until your lungs burned, or carrying buckets of someone else's waste through narrow streets. Some jobs were dirty, some were deadly, some were both, with a bonus side of humiliation. And the best part, you probably couldn't quit. Because if you weren't born rich, you didn't get to dream of career choices. You just did what your father did. And if your father was a rat catcher, well, congratulations, you were now the family's rodent management expert. Let's start with the tenor, the poor soul responsible for turning animal hides into usable leather. Romantic, right? Picture it, a small, smoky workshop on the edge of town, where the stench was so bad that even the rats gave it a wide berth. Tanners worked with rotting animal skins soaked in urine and pigeon droppings to loosen the hair. Yes, actual urine. They collected it from public pee pots. Imagine being paid to ask strangers for their bodily waste. Then they'd stomp the hides barefoot in these lovely mixtures for hours. By the end of the day, their skin was stained yellow, their clothes reeked, and nobody wanted to sit near them at church. But hey, somebody had to make the king's fancy leather boots, right? Then there were gong farmers. Now, if you're thinking, that sounds kind of pleasant, like someone who farms gongs. No, these were the night workers who cleaned out the cesspits beneath public latrines and castle privies. In simpler terms, medieval sanitation engineers who shoveled human waste for a living. Their office was a dark pit filled with centuries of filth, and the job came with serious risks. Poisonous gases could build up in those pits, and it wasn't rare for a gong farmer to just pass out and never wake up again. They were required by law to work at night because no one wanted to see or smell what they were doing. Imagine walking home after your shift, everyone just quietly stepping aside, pretending not to breathe. Glamorous? Not exactly. And yet, gong farmers were better paid than you'd expect, because literally no one else wanted to do it. They made more money than most peasants, and some could even buy small plots of land. But still, you couldn't wash away that kind of reputation. The smell followed you everywhere. Another dream job of the Middle Ages. The leech collector. These were mostly poor women who spent hours wading through swampy water to catch blood-sucking leeches for physicians. Medicine back then was basically a weird mix of superstition and guesswork. And everyone believed that draining your blood could cure almost anything. So leech collectors used their own legs as bait. They'd stand knee-deep in marshes, wait for the leeches to latch on, then peel them off and toss them into jars. Infection, blood loss, and exhaustion were all part of the job. And the payment, a few pennies per jar, barely enough to buy bread. But let's not forget about medieval executioners. You might think that's a powerful gig, swinging swords and all that. But no, it was lonely work. Executioners were often shunned by society. People needed them, but no one wanted to share a meal with them. Some were born into the trade. Their fathers were executioners, so they had no choice. Their homes were usually outside city walls, near the gallows or the dump. And while they sometimes got extra pay or gifts, maybe a few coins or a chicken from grateful victims, families, the emotional toll was heavy. You weren't respected, you were feared. Now, imagine being a medieval barber. You'd think, cutting hair, easy enough. But these barbers weren't just snipping bangs, they were pulling teeth, setting broken bones, and performing bloodletting procedures with tools that looked like torture devices. The red-danned white barber pole. That's not just decoration. It's a leftover symbol from those bloodletting days. Red for blood, white for bandages. So yeah, you came in for a haircut and left with fewer teeth and a bandaged arm. the medieval equivalent of a combo deal. And if you were lucky enough to work in a castle, things weren't necessarily better. A spitboy or turnspit had one of the most miserable positions in the kitchen. Their entire job was to sit by the fire and turn a roasting spit by hand for hours. It was hot, smoky, and mind-numbingly boring. Some wealthy households even trained small dogs, called turnspit dogs, to run on little hamster wheel-like contraptions to rotate the spits. But for human workers, it meant endless burns and smoke in your lungs, all for a meal they rarely got to taste. Blacksmiths, too, had it rough. People think of them as strong and heroic, hammering away in a shower of sparks. But their lives were grueling. 12-hour days of lifting, pounding, and breathing in soot. Their joints wore out early, their lungs filled with smoke, and most died before old age. Still, blacksmiths were respected. The village relied on them for tools, weapons, and horseshoes. So at least they got something. Tannis and gong farmers didn't. A bit of dignity. The lamplighters, on the other hand, worked in darkness, literally. Every night, they'd walk through towns, lighting oil lamps, climbing ladders, replacing wicks, and making sure the streets didn't plunge into total blackness. It was lonely, cold work, and if they fell from a ladder, well, medieval healthcare wasn't exactly encouraging. And then there were the fuller's people, who cleaned and thickened wool cloth. Their process, soaking the fabric in stale urine and trampling it for hours to clean it. Yes, urine again. It was basically medieval bleach. They worked barefoot in giant vats of liquid waste, singing songs to pass the time. It said that you could smell a fulling mill long before you saw it. Being a servant wasn't glamorous either. You were at the mercy of your master's mood, and sometimes room and board was your entire payment. You'd wait before dawn, clean, cook, fetch water, and bow constantly. But hey, you got to live indoors, which made you luckier than the field hands. Speaking of which, agricultural peasants had the most back-breaking life of all. Dawn to dusk, every single day, working the Lord's fields in all weather. They paid rent and crops, gave taxes to the church, and still had to feed their families from whatever was left. Most never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace. Their world was small, muddy, and endlessly repetitive. And yet, there's something weirdly grounding about it. Life was harsh, yes, but it was also simple in a way we can hardly imagine. You worked, you ate, you slept. Tomorrow, you did it again. The worst jobs of medieval history weren't just disgusting or dangerous. They were a reminder that most of human existence has been about endurance. Quiet, thankless endurance. But still, next time you're annoyed about emails or office meetings, maybe spare a thought for the poor tanner stomping hides in a vat of urine, or the leech collector standing knee-deep in a swamp. You might just feel a little better about your job. And with that, we close another long, slow drift through the strange, smelly world of medieval labor. Because no matter how bad your day gets, at least you're not the guy shoveling cesspits in 1347. By the time the medieval sun rose a dim, smoky light, filtering through thatched roofs, the peasants were already deep into their daily grind. And grind is probably the right word. If you weren't knee-deep in mud, you were inhaling dust from a mill, or smoke from a forge. Every job had its signature misery. And yet somehow, everyone kept going. Because stopping meant starving. Take the millers, for example. At first glance, their job sounded decent, grinding grain into flour, an essential part of the community. They got to work indoors, surrounded by the comforting rhythm of the turning wheel. But millers had a bad reputation. Everyone assumed they were thieves. Not because they actually stole, though. To be fair, some did, but because they took a small cut of everyone's grain as payment. And if your loaf came out lighter than usual, well, it was always the miller's fault. They lived comfortably for peasants, but socially, they were about as trusted as a used car salesman at a monastery. Then, there were rat catchers. Now, this job required a particular kind of courage or complete lack of self-preservation. Rats were everywhere in medieval towns, crawling through grain stores, nesting under beds, carrying fleas that spread diseases like the plague. Rat catchers had to get up close and personal with the little monsters, armed with nothing but a stick, a sack, and occasionally a small ferret trained to chase rodents out of holes. Their work was considered heroic in theory, but in practice, they were seen as dirty. Another reminder that in medieval times, doing a job that actually helped people didn't mean they respected you for it. If you were born into a fishing village, your life revolved around salt, nets, and the unpredictable moods of the sea. Fishermen woke long before dawn, risking cold waves, broken boats, and the occasional shark, all to bring home a few baskets of salted herring. And those weren't for them. Mind you, the church demanded tons of fish during fasting seasons, because eating meat was forbidden. So the fishermen supplied the wealthy monasteries and nobles, while they themselves lived on scraps. And if you think handling dead fish sounds unpleasant, try being a gravedigger. During normal times, it was a quiet, lonely job, digging holes, filling them in, over and over. But when plague or famine hit, gravediggers were the busiest men in town. They couldn't dig fast enough. They worked with cloths tied over their faces, surrounded by the sick and dying. Most didn't last long themselves. It was one of the few jobs where you could literally dig your own final resting place without realizing it. Metalworkers and miners had their own kind of torment. Deep underground, medieval miners hacked away at rock using pickaxes and hammers, with no proper ventilation. They breathed in dust, choked on fumes, and prayed the ceiling didn't collapse. Some mines were so deep that the heat alone could make men faint. Yet mining was lucrative. Not for the miners, of course, but for the lords who owned the land above. The workers got meager pay, broken lungs, and maybe, if they were lucky, a reputation for being sturdy fellows. And then there were the candle makers. Sounds cozy, right? Maybe you picture them as gentle artisans, surrounded by warm light and melted wax. In reality, candle making was a nauseating business. The cheaper candles weren't made from beeswax. Those were for churches and the rich, but from tallow, which is rendered animal fat. Boiling vats of it produced a stench that clung to the maker's hair, clothes, and soul. When mixed with smoke and soot, the smell was so strong that entire neighborhoods avoided tallow workshops. For women, options were even more limited. Many ended up as washerwomen, scrubbing clothes in freezing rivers, hands raw and red. Laundry meant beating garments with wooden paddles, hauling buckets, and dealing with stains that no medieval soap could conquer. If a noble family hired you, you might wash their linens by hand, then hang them over hedges to dry, all while being invisible to the people you served. Midwives, on the other hand, carried enormous responsibility. They weren't just birth attendants, they were the closest thing to doctors most women would ever have, but their success depended entirely on luck and experience. If a baby or mother died, which happened often, the midwife could face blame, suspicion, or worse, accusations of witchcraft. Yet, without them, entire villages would have been lost. Traveling performers, known as jongleurs, fared slightly better, though better is doing a lot of work there. They roamed from town to town, playing music, juggling, or telling jokes for coins. They lived free but dangerously. No job security, no home, and constant risk of getting robbed on the road. The church viewed them as immoral. Two entertainers were often banned from sacred grounds, but they were the ones who brought a spark of laughter to an otherwise gray and grim world. And in every medieval town, there were apprentices, young boys bound to masters, learning trades like tailoring, carpentry, or smithing. Sounds noble, right? Except apprenticeships were basically unpaid labor. You worked from sunrise to sunset for years, endured scolding, beatings, and constant exhaustion, all for the hope of one day becoming a journeyman and maybe earning a few coins. Some never made it that far. The truth was, medieval life didn't offer comfort to anyone below the upper class. Every profession had a price in dignity, in health, or in life expectancy. You didn't work for fulfillment. You worked because it was survival. And that's probably why medieval art and records rarely show peasants smiling. After all, there wasn't much to smile about when your daily grind involved filth, danger, or open flame. Even the church workers, who were supposed to live peaceful lives of prayer, often had their own set of problems. Monks spent long hours copying manuscripts in cold, dim rooms, their backs aching, their hands cramping, eyes straining by candlelight. It was monotonous work, but in an age without printing presses, it was vital. Their tired hands preserved the wisdom of centuries. Meanwhile, outside the abbey walls, life roared on, smelly, loud, and hard. The wheel of labor never stopped turning. And while today we can joke about the worst jobs in history, for them, this was just existence. There were no weekends, no holidays, no quitting, just another day trying to survive the Middle Ages. Somewhere between the noise of the forges and the reek of tallow, you'd find another group of unfortunate souls, the gong farmers. The name sounds almost respectable, doesn't it? Farmer evokes open fields, sunshine, maybe a pleasant breeze. In reality, gong farmers were the medieval equivalent of sewage workers. Their job was to climb down into cesspits, scrape out the human waste that had been collecting for months, and haul it away in buckets. They worked mostly at night because, understandably, nobody wanted to see them or smell them during the day. The pay was actually decent compared to other peasant jobs. But it came with a trade-off, permanent stench and a very short lifespan. If the fumes didn't kill you, a sudden collapse of the pit walls might. And yes, people did fall in. And no, it was not a quick way to go. Being a gong farmer was one of those jobs where you'd never shake hands with anyone again. You could bathe all you wanted, but the smell, it stayed like a curse. Next in line were the leech collectors. Before modern medicine, the humble leech was a prized medical tool. Doctors believed that draining blood could balance your humors, those mysterious fluids that supposedly governed health and mood. Leech collectors waded into ponds and marshes barefoot, letting the little parasites attach to their legs so they could harvest them later. Each bite drew blood and left sores that often became infected. Still, leech collectors trudged on, bucket after bucket, because leeches sold well. Medicine was big business, even when it was mostly guesswork. Speaking of medicine, let's talk about barbers. Today, they're the friendly folks who ask how you want your fade. Back then, there were also surgeons. A barber surgeon could shave your beard, lance your boils, pull your teeth, and maybe even amputate your arm, all before lunch. Their tools were sharp, but not necessarily clean, and their qualifications ranged from apprentice once watched someone do it to seems confident. The iconic barber pole, with its red and white stripes, symbolized blood and bandages, a cheerful reminder that your next haircut might come with minor surgery. Then there were tanners. If you think leather smells bad now, imagine processing it in a time before chemical treatments and proper drains. Tanners soaked animal hides in urine and animal brains to loosen the hair before scraping it off by hand. The result, permanent exposure to foul odors and chemical burns from the lime vats. Tanneries were always located downstream or far from town because nobody could stand the smell. But without them, there'd be no belts, shoes, or armor, so the community tolerated their presence like you tolerate a noisy neighbor. And while we're on the topic of bad smells, the butcher's job wasn't a picnic either. Butchers had constant contact with blood, flies, and rotting meat. In the summer heat, the stench could turn even the strongest stomach. They worked with primitive tools, often hacking more than slicing, and sanitation was a myth. Still, butchers held a strange kind of importance. People needed meat, and that meant they needed the butcher, even if they avoided eye contact while buying their cuts. In the countryside, life was no gentler. The shepherds, those peaceful figures in storybooks, endured endless isolation. They spent weeks, sometimes months, out in the fields with their flocks. Rain, frost, wolves, take your pick. The pay was minimal, and the company mostly woolly. Loneliness was part of the job description. Yet, strangely, many shepherds preferred it. Away from lords, taxes, and gossip, they could at least breathe fresh air and smell only the sheep, which was arguably an upgrade from tanneries and cesspits. And if you wanted to risk your life for the smallest return, you could always become a chimney sweep. By the later medieval period, as fireplaces became more common, someone had to keep those chimneys clean. The task often fell to small boys who could squeeze into narrow shafts and scrape away the soot. They suffered burns, suffocation, and long-term lung damage. It was one of those jobs society didn't talk about much, uncomfortable, necessary, and quietly cruel. Even trades that sound artistic had their share of misery. Take glassblowers, for example. Working near blazing furnaces all day, they endured scorching heat and the constant risk of burns or blindness. Their workshops glittered, but their lungs filled with fine dust and ash. Or scribes, the educated ones who could actually read and write. Sounds cushy, right? Except they spent their lives hunched over parchment, inhaling fumes from ink, and trying not to make a single mistake that could ruin an entire page. No backspace, no whiteout, just endless repetition until your wrist cramped and your vision blurred. And at the very bottom of the heap were the beggars and street sweepers. Sweepers trudged through narrow alleys with brooms made of sticks, pushing aside trash, manure, and whatever else people threw out their windows. It was thankless, filthy, and constant work. Beggars had it worse. No job, no security, just survival on the kindness of strangers who often had none to spare. Yet somehow, the world kept spinning. Markets opened, bells rang, bakers kneaded their dough before sunrise, blacksmiths hammered iron until sparks lit the dusk. Everyone had a role to play, even if that role came with blisters, burns, or fleas. If there was one unspoken truth about medieval labor, it was this. No matter how terrible your job seemed, there was always someone doing worse. The gong farmer envied the tanner envied the miller envied the monk, and the monk, somewhere deep in prayer, probably envied anyone who could actually get a full night's sleep, because rest, much like clean air or dignity, was a luxury few could afford. And if you think the noble or churchly professions offered any kind of relief, think again. The medieval monk, often romanticized as a serene figure humming chants in candlelight, actually lived a life of relentless routine and questionable comfort. Sure, the monastery spared you from the plow or forge, but it came with its own kind of misery. You'd wake before dawn every single day to the sound of a bell that never failed to interrupt your one decent dream. Then you'd shuffle barefoot through the cold stone halls for prayers that lasted so long they could double as endurance tests. Meals were plain and repetitive. Bread, beans, maybe fish on a good day, and silence was mandatory. You couldn't even complain about how bad the fish smelled. And then there were the scribes among them, bent over their desks, copying manuscripts in freezing rooms lit by a single, sputtering candle. Their eyesight often failed, their backs ached, and the ink stains never left their hands. But still, it beat starvation. Monks knew how to endure discomfort with quiet resignation, which, come to think of it, was kind of the medieval motto for everyone. Meanwhile, over in the castles, the supposed centers of wealth and refinement, things weren't much better for the servants. Take the kitchen staff, for instance. A medieval castle kitchen was chaos incarnate. Fires burned constantly, spits turned for hours, and everything, and I mean everything, was cooked in animal fat. The floors were slick, the air smoky, and burns were just part of the job description. You could spend 12 hours preparing a feast only to be scolded because the pheasant wasn't crispy enough. The scullery maid, the lowest in the kitchen hierarchy, bore the brunt of it all. Her day began before dawn, scrubbing pots blackened by soot, carrying buckets of water heavier than she was, and enduring an endless parade of barking orders. She'd collapse at night with blistered hands and the faint smell of onions that would never quite wash off. And if you weren't in the kitchen, you might find yourself working as a groom or stable boy, another job that sounds quaint until you're knee-deep in horse muck before sunrise. Stables were loud, smelly, and full of creatures that could injure you without meaning to. Horses kicked, bit, and occasionally decided you were the problem. Grooms slept in straw nearby, always ready to tend to their lord's prized animals, even if it meant missing meals or losing fingers to frostbite in winter. But none of these compared to the pure indignity of being a medieval messenger. Picture this: no postal system, no maps worth trusting, and a road that's mostly mud and bandits. Your job: deliver a letter from one noble to another, sometimes across hundreds of miles. You were lucky if you had a horse. Most didn't. Messengers trudged through rain, snow, and the occasional war zone, only to be yelled at because the seal on the parchment was slightly smudged. And let's not forget the miners, those poor souls who descended into narrow, torchlit tunnels in search of tin, silver, or salt. The air was thick, the tools crude, and the supports questionable. Cave-ins were common, as were lung problems from inhaling dust all day. Yet mining paid better than farming, which says more about medieval farming than it does about mining. Then there were the millers, who occupied an oddly hated niche. On paper, they had it good. They controlled the grain, which meant people depended on them. But they were also notorious for skimming a little extra flour off the top. It became such a common stereotype that honest miller was practically an oxymoron. Villagers tolerated them because they had to, all while muttering under their breath as the mill's great wheel creaked on. Let's also spare a thought for the laundresses, the unsung heroes of hygiene in a time when cleanliness was more of a rumor. They spent their days beating dirty clothes against rocks by the river, their hands raw from cold water and lye soap. Laundry was back-breaking work, literally. And after all that scrubbing, the clothes were still a shade of almost clean at best. If you were especially unlucky, you might find yourself as a plague barrier during one of the darker chapters of medieval history. When disease swept through towns, someone had to gather the dead. It was grim, terrifying work, often done under the cover of night, with no protection except a thin layer of cloth over the face. Pay was high, but the risk was higher. Most didn't live long enough to spend their wages. And still, people lined up for these jobs because survival didn't care about dignity. Every role, from gong farmer to monk, from miner to laundress, was part of the grinding machinery that kept the medieval world turning. Yet, for all their hardships, there was an odd sort of rhythm to it, a cycle of work, exhaustion, and brief, fleeting contentment when the day was finally done. They didn't dream of vacations or promotions. They just dreamed of making it to morning. And somehow, that was enough. Of course, not all medieval misery came from physical labor. Some of it was emotional, psychological, and just plain absurd. Take the professional fool, for example. You might imagine him as a colorful jester with bells on his hat, telling witty jokes at banquets. In reality, the job was part comedy, part survival instinct. The fool's entire career depended on the mood of his master. If the king was amused, you might live to make him laugh another day. If he wasn't, well, let's just say you could suddenly find yourself retired, permanently. The line between entertainment and execution was surprisingly thin. These jesters weren't always fools in the modern sense, either. Many were sharp observers, using humor to comment on the ridiculousness of royal life. Carefully, of course. A single poorly timed joke about a noble's questionable family tree could end with you chained in the courtyard. Imagine being forced to dance for your life, and then realizing that this was literally your profession. If you preferred your humiliation without the risk of beheading, you might have opted to be a servant in a wealthy household. It sounds cushy until you realize the full scope of what servant actually meant. You'd wake before dawn to start fires, fetch water, and make sure your lord's chamber pot was, well, empty. Privacy wasn't a concept that applied to you. Nobles didn't dress themselves, so you were right there for every awkward morning routine. The pay was meager, the hours endless, and your boss, probably convinced you didn't exist beyond your ability to refill a goblet. And then there were the watchmen. Those poor souls tasked with keeping towns safe. They patrolled the dark, often alone, armed with nothing but a wooden staff and the hope that nobody decided to rob them instead. Medieval towns were not quiet at night. Between drunken brawls, fires, and the occasional wandering pig, there was always something to deal with. The job was thankless and dangerous, and the only perk was maybe getting first dibs on gossip, assuming you survived till morning. One particularly grim line of work was executioner. Contrary to what people might assume, being an executioner wasn't glamorous. It came with social exile. People didn't want to live near you, touch you, or even stand downwind of you. Yet society couldn't do without you either. You were the necessary evil, the hand that enforced justice when no one else wanted to. Executioners often lived on the edge of town, half feared and half hated, with their children ostracized in yards. And while the job technically paid well, it came at the cost of your humanity. You might get a free drink in the tavern, but only because no one wanted to be on your bad side. Even those in charge of moral enforcement weren't exactly living the good life. The church employed beadles and summoners, spent their days dragging sinners to court for offenses like gossip, missing church, or eating meat on the wrong day. People despised them. They were basically the medieval version of that coworker who tattles to the boss. And because hypocrisy was always a favorite medieval pastime, many of these moral enforcers were guilty of the same sins they punished others for. If you had medical ambitions, you could become a barber surgeon. Yes, the guy who cut your hair was often the same one who'd cheerfully cut your arm open. Their skills ranged from decent to downright horrifying, and their tools were more suited for carpentry than medicine. The famous barber pole we still see today, red, white, and blue, comes from this era. The red symbolized blood, the white represented bandages, and the blue, if included, supposedly stood for veins. Charming, isn't it? Patients lined up anyway, desperate for relief from ailments that modern medicine would fix in minutes. A barber surgeon might bleed you to balance your humors, set a bone using questionable physics, or even remove a tooth with a twist and a prayer. Pain relief, not a thing. You were told to bite down on wood and offer it to God. Imagine leaving the barber shop with a shave and an accidental partial lobotomy. And if none of these sound appealing, you could always take up work as a medieval teacher, a profession as noble as it was miserable. Classrooms were cold, students were rowdy, and the pay was pitiful. Discipline was enforced with sticks rather than kindness, and memorization was the only teaching method that mattered. Teachers had little authority outside the classroom, often seen as failed clerics or underpaid scholars. You could spend your life educating the next generation of nobles and still die penniless in a rented room above a tavern. What makes all of this almost funny, in a very bleak way, is that these people thought it was normal. Every class, every profession, every rung of the social ladder came with its own flavor of suffering. There was no dream job. There was only less terrible than dying of hunger. And in that grim reality, people found their strange sense of pride. Because even if you were just the lowly night soil man or the overworked kitchen maid, at least you were alive, and in the medieval world, that was already winning. If you think the worst of it ended there, oh no, medieval society had a truly creative streak when it came to inventing misery. Consider, for instance, the gong farmer. No, that wasn't a cute term for someone tending crops. Gong meant human waste. The gong farmer's noble task was to climb into cesspits and dig out everything that people flushed away by hand, in the dark, with little more than a bucket and a candle stub. The smell alone could knock out a mule, but this was considered honest work. They were paid decently because no one else would do it, though the job came with a lifespan shorter than a royal marriage. Some of these poor souls suffocated from the fumes or drowned in what can only be politely described as the stuff. Imagine spending your entire night knee-deep in human waste, then trying to wash off the stench with cold well water and hope your neighbors didn't faint when you walked by. Medieval hygiene wasn't winning any awards, and these workers were the reason the streets didn't become entirely unlivable. They were the unsung heroes of sanitation, albeit very smelly ones. Then there were rat catchers, who, on paper, performed a valuable public service. Rats carried disease, and the bubonic plague didn't exactly need encouragement. The job required quick reflexes, a strong stomach, and an even stronger disregard for self-preservation. Rat catchers used traps, poison, and sometimes even ferrets to flush out their prey. They often carried the corpses of dead rats around town as proof of their work, and possibly as a warning. But rats bite, scratch, and carry fleas, which in turn carry plague. So yes, Your daily grind involved chasing tiny death machines through filthy alleys for pennies. And speaking of grim professions, we can't skip over the tanner, the person responsible for turning animal hides into leather. The tanning process was an olfactory nightmare. Skins had to be soaked in vats of urine, dung, and lime. Workers stirred them barefoot, because why ruin shoes when you can ruin your feet instead? Tanneries were usually located outside city walls for obvious reasons. The stench traveled for miles, and people living nearby were considered unlucky. Still, leather was essential for everything from armor to shoes, and someone had to make it happen. Unfortunately, that someone was perpetually reeking of decay and chemicals strong enough to make a horse cry. There was also the fulling trade, a job involving wool. Fullers had to clean and thicken cloth by stomping on it in vats of stale urine. Yes, urine again. Apparently, medieval Europe had endless faith in the power of bodily fluids. Fullers worked barefoot, knee-deep in pungent liquid for hours, until the fabric reached a perfect texture. Imagine explaining that to your children. Papa makes cloth by stepping in pee all day. It's not exactly a bedtime story. Then we arrive at the leech collector, whose job was just as grim as it sounds. Before modern medicine, bloodletting was a popular cure for nearly everything. Headaches, fevers, bad moods, you name it. Leeches were the go-to tool for that, and someone had to gather them. So leech collectors waded into swamps and ponds, letting the creatures latch onto their legs. Once enough leeches were attached, they'd pry them off, store them, and repeat, day after day. The job didn't pay much, and the constant blood loss often left workers weak and anemic. Yet, it was considered respectable if you didn't mind being covered in bite marks and occasionally passing out from dizziness. Of course, if you were truly unlucky, you might end up in the role of a plague cleaner. During outbreaks, their task was to remove corpses from homes and streets. Picture it, piles of the dead, the stench unbearable, the fear of infection ever present. There was no protective gear, just rags, masks stuffed with herbs, and pure desperation. These workers faced death every day, handling the remains of friends and neighbors. Some were criminals offered mercy work in exchange for lighter sentences. Others were simply too poor to refuse. It wasn't bravery that kept them going, it was hunger. Then there were gong scourers, tasked with cleaning public latrines and river drains. And if you think that's redundant with gong farmers, oh no, this was worse. Farmers dealt with waste from cesspits. Scourers handled the overflow that made it into the streets and waterways. Their job was to unclog medieval plumbing before it turned entire neighborhoods into biohazards. And since medieval pipes were often wooden channels or open ditches, you can imagine just how glamorous that was. The truly tragic part: most of these workers were invisible to the people they served. Nobles never saw the gong farmer who kept their castles from stinking, or the tanner who made their gloves soft enough to impress the court. The social hierarchy didn't just separate rich from poor, it made certain professions disappear entirely. From polite conversation, you could walk through a bustling medieval town and never notice the ones who kept it running. In a sense, medieval life was a massive pyramid of misery, with each layer resting on the suffering of those below it. The peasants worked the land, the craftsmen kept cities functional, and the laborers cleaned up the aftermath of everyone else's mess. And through it all, they found tiny ways to make life bearable: songs, jokes, and the occasional strong drink. Because when your job involves wading through filth or chasing vermin, a little humor goes a long way. And if you thought it couldn't possibly get worse, let's talk about the medieval executioner. Technically, it was a job, a necessary one, according to the laws of the time. But it was also a social death sentence. Executioners were both feared and despised. People needed them, yet no one wanted to be seen shaking their hand at the market. They were often forced to live outside the city walls, near graveyards or gallows, and their children inherited their social stigma. Ironically, executioners were sometimes well paid, and even respected for their precision. After all, a clean beheading was considered merciful, while a botched one could turn into a grotesque public spectacle. The job required a steady hand, strong nerves, and a surprising amount of skill. You couldn't just grab a sword and start swinging. Executioners trained for years. Many practiced on animals to perfect their technique. Some were even given the responsibility of torture before executions, extracting confessions through methods that were, let's say, far from gentle. The contradiction was darkly comedic. They were essential to justice, but never allowed to enjoy the company of just people. Imagine being the one man no one wanted to dine with, even though your work kept the peace in the bloodiest way possible. Then there were the medieval gravediggers, a profession that thrived whenever disease did. It was a grim, endless cycle of digging, burying, and digging again. During plagues, their work never stopped. Some reportedly dug graves for entire days without pause, surrounded by the sick, the dead, and the dying. Payment was meager, but what other choice did they have? Better to be digging graves than lying in one, as they might have said. Gravediggers were the invisible hands keeping towns from turning into open-air cemeteries. Their bodies ached, their lungs filled with dust, and their faces aged far beyond their years. Yet, at night, they still went to the tavern, drank their ale, told their morbid jokes, and came back the next morning with shovels in hand. Let's not forget the humble miller, whose job sounds peaceful, but was far from it. Running a mill meant dealing with endless noise, dust, and backbreaking maintenance. Millers often had to lift huge sacks of grain, repair wooden machinery, and deal with customers accusing them of cheating, because, apparently, every miller in history was assumed to be skimming a little off the top. Mills were dangerous, too. One wrong move near the grinding stones or water wheel could cost you a limb. Yet, the miller's song was a common one in medieval villages, rhythmic, steady, and weary. And then came the barbers. Yes, barbers. In the Middle Ages, they weren't just trimming beards and cutting hair. They were also surgeons, tooth pullers, and minor doctors. A barber surgeon might give you a shave one moment and amputate your leg the next. Their shops were marked by the familiar red and white poles, symbolizing blood and bandages. The tools they used were basic, to put it kindly, and hygiene was a foreign concept. Yet, for centuries, barbers were the go-to professionals for anything vaguely medical: boils, cuts, broken bones, you name it. It's safe to say their customers often left looking and feeling worse than when they entered. Then there were shepherds. It might sound idyllic: green fields, soft wool, and peaceful days, but the reality: long hours, isolation, and unpredictable weather. Shepherds slept outdoors with their flocks, fought off wolves, and spent weeks alone with only the sheep for company. Pay was miserable, and food was whatever they could carry. Many were teenagers or drifters, people with nowhere else to go. Still, there was a quiet dignity to it. The stars above, the sound of wind through the hills, and the occasional stolen nap in the grass. If you were lucky, you made it through the season without losing too many sheep or your sanity. One of the lesser-known but equally miserable jobs was that of the lime burner. Lime was essential for construction, used in mortar, plaster, and whitewash, but producing it meant standing next to roaring kilns, day and night. The air was full of choking dust and heat so intense it could blister your skin. Workers inhaled the fine powder, which corroded their lungs and eyes. Yet lime burners powered the growth of cities, building walls, cathedrals, and castles. Their world was fire and stone, grueling, filthy, and utterly thankless. And if none of these sound bad enough, there were always street cleaners. Imagine trudging through muddy streets filled with animal waste, spoiled food, and the occasional unfortunate carcass. Your job was to shovel it all away before it rotted further. Not an easy feat in a time without proper sanitation. Street cleaners were constantly splattered, always stinking, and frequently ill. Yet they worked relentlessly, because if they didn't, everyone else would be wading through filth by morning. These were the people who kept medieval life running. They didn't have glory, fame, or comfort, but they had purpose. Every foul task, every back-breaking hour, kept society from collapsing under its own mess. In a strange way, they were the quiet backbone of the age. And though no bard ever sang songs about gong farmers or gravediggers, their work mattered just as much as any knight's sword or king's decree. Now, if you ever find yourself romanticizing medieval times, the castles, the banquets, the shining armor, just remember the people who had to make all that possible. Someone had to clean up after the feasts, someone had to sharpen the swords, and someone had to shovel the royal. Well, you get the idea. Take, for instance, the tanner. Working with animal hides might sound straightforward, but in practice, it was a nightmare of smells and substances that no one should ever have to endure. Tanneries were usually set up far from town, near rivers or streams, not for the scenic view, but because the work reeked so badly that no one wanted them nearby. Tanners soaked animal skins in vats of urine, feces, and lime to loosen the hair and fat. Yes, you heard that right. They used actual human and animal waste as part of the process. They'd then scrape the hides clean by hand, dry them, and treat them with more chemicals until they were usable leather. The smell clung to them like a curse. A tanner could be spotted, or rather, smelled, from several streets away. And yet, leather was in constant demand for armor, shoes, saddles, belts, and bags. So while society gagged at their presence, it also relied entirely on their work. Then we have the fullers, another profession that sounds innocent until you know what they did. Fulling was the process of cleaning and thickening woolen cloth after it was woven. The early method, they stomped on it, literally. Workers would stand barefoot in troughs filled with a mix of water, clay, and, once again, urine. They trampled the cloth for hours, sometimes days, to cleanse and tighten the fibers. The ammonia helped remove oils and dirt, but the stench was enough to make your eyes water. Fullers often worked in small, dimly lit rooms with no ventilation, inhaling fumes until they could barely breathe. And yet, the result, soft, durable cloth, was a staple of medieval wardrobes. It's safe to say their suffering kept everyone else dressed in style. Then there were the leech collectors. Before modern medicine, leeches were considered almost magical, a cure for everything from fever to headaches to imbalances of the humors. So naturally, someone had to go get them. Leech collectors waded barefoot into marshes and ponds, letting the creatures attach themselves to their legs. When they were full of blood, the collectors peeled them off and stored them for doctors and barbers. Sounds like a relaxing day job, right? Except for the part where they'd often faint from blood loss or infection. The leeches spread disease, and the collectors carried scars and sores that never quite healed. But leeches sold well, and money, even bad, muddy, blood-stained money, was money. We can't forget the gong farmers' unlucky cousins, the cesspit cleaners of larger cities. When the pits filled up, it was their job to climb in, yes, in, and shovel the mess out by hand. They worked mostly at night to avoid both the crowds and the smell in the heat of the day. They wore old clothes, soaked in vinegar to cut the stench, and sometimes tied herbs around their faces like primitive gas masks. The work was lethal. Methane buildup could suffocate them in minutes. Yet, the pay was surprisingly high. So, many took the risk, figuring that a few nights of horror might buy them months of food. It's not exactly the medieval version of winning the lottery, but it came close. Another unfortunate group was the corpse bearers, those tasked with carrying the dead during plagues. When the Black Death hit Europe, entire families vanished in days, and the only people left to move the bodies were the desperate and the damned. They went door to door with carts, piling up the deceased and hauling them to mass graves. The job paid in coin, food, or sometimes just shelter. They rarely lasted long. Infection was inevitable. Still, without them, cities would have drowned in their dead. Their work was silent, necessary, and almost entirely forgotten, except in the echo of those grim church bells. Meanwhile, bakers in medieval towns had their own kind of misery. It sounds homey, warm ovens, the smell of bread, people lining up for fresh loaves, but the job was relentless. Bakers worked at night so that bread would be ready by dawn. They endured unbearable heat, heavy lifting, and constant inspections from local authorities, who checked that bread wasn't underweight or overpriced. Bakers caught cheating could be publicly shamed, fined, or even tied to a post, with their bad loaves hanging around their necks. The work was so exhausting that some literally fell asleep while kneading dough, waking up just in time to start again. And then came the water carriers, another essential but thankless role. Before plumbing, they were the ones hauling buckets from wells or rivers to every home in town. Day after day, climbing stairs, trudging streets, spilling half their pay on the cobblestones. It was brutally physical work, often done by women and children, and yet it barely kept them alive. Their shoulders bruised, their backs bent, and still, every house needed water for washing, cooking, and drinking. They were the invisible lifeline of medieval cities. By now, it's becoming clear that the Middle Ages weren't just an age of knights and nobles. They were an age of endless drudgery for the masses. Every piece of comfort the rich enjoyed was built on someone else's suffering. The clean floors, the soft clothes, the fresh bread, all paid for in sweat, blood, and, occasionally, sewage. It's oddly poetic, in a tragic sort of way. Society needed its cleaners, its diggers, its tanners, and its bakers far more than its kings. But history, being the snob that it is, only remembers the crowns. And while the kings and nobles strutted around in embroidered silk, there were the people who made those silks shimmer, the dyers. If you've ever admired the deep reds and purples of medieval robes, you might not know that those colors were born from smells that could knock a cow unconscious. Dyers used vats filled with concoctions of plants, minerals, and, disturbingly often, rotting animal matter. For bright reds, they used crushed insects. For deep blues, fermented plants. And for certain shades of yellow, they used, wait for it, urine again. Collecting it wasn't exactly glamorous either. They'd leave pots outside homes labeled for donations. And when people contributed, the dyers hauled it off for processing, working in that haze of heat, stink, and fumes. It's a wonder they didn't pass out daily. Their hands were stained, their clothes were ruined, and yet they colored the world for everyone else. Then there were the lime burners. You needed lime for mortar, for plaster, and for countless other building materials. But producing it was dangerous. Lime burners stood over roaring kilns, feeding them with stone and wood until they glowed white-hot. The dust burned skin and blinded eyes. The heat warped lungs. One wrong breath and you could choke on lime powder, which mixed with moisture in the air to form acid in your throat. But someone had to keep the construction going. Castles, churches, cathedrals, so lime burners did their job in the shadows of history, coughing their lives away for the sake of medieval architecture. Now, if you thought being a servant to nobility was better, think again. The castle kitchens were a different kind of battlefield. Imagine the heat of several fires going all day, the shouting, the grease, the smoke. Cooks and their assistants worked non-stop, chopping meat, boiling stews, baking pies. Burns were constant. Food poisoning was common, and the hierarchy was brutal. The master cook gave orders like a general, and the scullions, the lowest rank, did everything no one else wanted to do. Cleaning pots blackened with soot, scraping leftovers off plates, fetching water, scrubbing floors. They were invisible and irreplaceable, the silent heartbeat of every feast. And for all their labor, they probably ate whatever scraps fell from the table, if they were lucky. The next miserable post belonged to the rat catchers. Cities and castles were crawling with vermin, and someone had to control them. Armed with traps, sticks, or occasionally a loyal terrier, rat catchers stalked the dark corners of medieval towns. The pay was uncertain. Sometimes they earned per rat, sometimes by contract. They risked bites, infections, and the general disgust of everyone around them. But they provided a vital service. Without them, plagues and food contamination would have been even worse. Ironically, many of them still carried disease home from their work. You could say it was a job that killed with consistency. And speaking of jobs with short life expectancies, let's talk about the miners. Medieval mining was no mechanized operation. It was men crawling into narrow tunnels with picks, candles, and hope. They hacked at rock, breathed dust, and prayed the ceiling wouldn't collapse. Ventilation was non-existent. Explosions, cave-ins, flooding, these weren't rare accidents. They were part of the job description. The miners emerged blackened, coughing, and half-deaf from hammering all day. Yet their work powered the kingdoms, the iron for swords, the silver for coins, the copper for tools. The lords above ground never saw the people who actually made their wealth glitter. Then we have the millers. Now, on paper, this one sounds better. Milling grain seems peaceful, windmills turning gracefully in the breeze, the gentle hum of grinding stone. But in reality, millers were some of the most hated people in medieval society. Why? Because they were seen as cheats. The process of grinding grain into flour involved 1,000 opportunities for loss, and many millers took their cut in more than one way. They'd skim flour, overcharge peasants, or manipulate weights. People needed them, but they never trusted them. And to make things worse, mill work was loud, dusty, and dangerous. If your clothing got caught in the machinery, it didn't end well. Still, millers trudged on, part villain, part necessity. One of the strangest and most miserable occupations had to be the professional mourner. During funerals, especially for the wealthy families, hired people to cry, loudly, convincingly. It was all about showing the world that the deceased had been deeply loved, whether or not that was true. So mourners wailed, beat their chests, and sobbed dramatically for hours. It was theater, really. The irony, of course, was that while nobles paid for the performance, the mourners themselves were usually poor, hungry, and barely hanging on. They made a living out of grief, not their own, but rented for the day. And let's not skip over the executioners. Yes, technically, it was an honorable role, sanctioned by law, part of the justice system. But socially, executioners were outcasts. People avoided them, refused to eat with them, even walked on the other side of the road. They were necessary, but hated, a living reminder of death. Their children were often ostracized too, doomed to follow the same trade because no one else would have them. They lived near the edges of towns, away from polite society, surrounded by silence and superstition. Every time they performed their duty, they deepened their isolation. A strange paradox, a job both powerful and lonely. Then there were the chimney sweeps, introduced later in the medieval period as cities expanded and heating systems evolved. Usually, it was children sent into the narrow chimneys, scraping soot by hand in the dark. They coughed, they choked, and they rarely grew up healthy. But fires needed tending, and the rich demanded comfort. So the sweeps kept crawling, blackened silhouettes against the glow of fireplaces that would never belong to them. By now, it's almost poetic how much misery went into maintaining medieval comfort. Every luxury, every soft bed, every warm bath, every feast had its price, paid by the unseen hands of the working poor. The Middle Ages, for all their grandeur, were powered by exhaustion. Every noble's banquet was balanced on 1,000 calloused backs. And though we remember the kings and queens, it was these people, the diggers, the dyers, the cooks, and the cleaners, who kept their world turning. And perhaps the most haunting thing about these medieval jobs wasn't just the physical suffering. It was the sense that almost none of it ever led anywhere. A peasant could spend an entire lifetime breaking his back in the same fields his father did, and his son would inherit not the land, but the labor. No promotions, no career growth, just the endless cycle of surviving another day. For many, the only escape was death or the church. And even that second option came with its own challenges. Monks might have lived quieter lives, but they weren't exactly lounging in luxury. They rose before dawn, worked the fields, copied manuscripts by candlelight, and often ate less than the peasants they prayed for. Some medieval workers, though, managed to find niches so odd that you almost have to respect the creativity. Take the gong farmers, for instance. The name sounds cute, but the job wasn't. They were the ones who cleaned out the castle latrines, massive pits of human waste, known as cesspits. Picture it, dark tunnels, foul air, knee-deep muck. They worked at night, not just because it was quieter, but because the smell was unbearable under the sun. The pay was surprisingly decent, but the social stigma was severe. People crossed themselves when gong farmers passed by. as if proximity alone might curse them. And then there were leech collectors. Medicine in the Middle Ages was, let's say, creative. Doctors believed that leeches could balance the body's humors, so naturally, someone had to gather them. That meant wading into stagnant ponds, letting the little creatures attach to your legs, and then pulling them off into jars. If you're thinking, that sounds unsanitary, you're absolutely right. These collectors often ended up with infections, fevers, and permanent scarring, all for a handful of slimy pay. Yet, they supplied one of the era's most popular medical tools. We also can't ignore the tanners, the people responsible for turning animal hides into leather. Tanning was a process so foul, it was usually done outside city limits. Workers soaked hides in urine and dog dung to soften them before scraping off flesh and fat by hand. The smell clung to their clothes, their hair, even their homes. They weren't welcome in markets or churches. They were the invisible backbone of medieval craftsmanship, making everything from shoes to saddles, but living permanently on the edge of society. And if that doesn't sound grim enough, imagine being a fuller, the worker tasked with cleaning and thickening wool cloth. Before mechanization, that process involved soaking fabric in tubs of stale urine and then stomping on it barefoot to press the fibers together. Yes, people literally danced in pee for a living. It was considered a vital trade, but hardly glamorous. Fullers were often half mad from the fumes. But hey, someone had to make those wool tunics soft and cozy for the wealthy. Speaking of bodily fluids, let's take a second to appreciate medieval barbers. They weren't just trimming beards, they were also surgeons, dentists, and general health practitioners. If you needed a tooth pulled, a vein opened, or an abscess drained, your barber was your man. The famous red and white barber pole that represents blood and bandages, a cheerful reminder of how casually people approached hygiene back then. Barbers worked with crude instruments, no anesthesia, and a strong stomach. Their customers, on the other hand, had to rely on luck and pain tolerance. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of some of these professions, but they reflect how every layer of medieval life was connected. The gong farmer's work kept the cities livable. The tanner's stench made shoes possible. The leech collector's misery was wrapped in the illusion of medical progress. There was no glamour without grime, no feasts without filth, no comfort without someone else's discomfort. And through it all, people still found pride in their craft. The blacksmith might have been blistered and deafened, but his ironwork lasted centuries. The mason who carved cathedral walls would never see his name recorded, but his stone would outlive kingdoms. Even the humblest trades carried a strange dignity, the quiet, stubborn belief that their suffering kept the world turning. What we remember as the glory of the Middle Ages, the castles, the cathedrals, the shining armor, was really a mosaic of human endurance. Every gleaming surface was polished by someone else's exhaustion, and maybe that's what makes the era both fascinating and tragic. Beneath the crowns and banners, it was built on sweat, smoke, and the smell of survival. By the time the late Middle Ages rolled around, a few of these miserable jobs began to change. Though change is generous, some were simply replaced by new forms of misery. Take miners, for example. As Europe's appetite for metal grew, mining exploded as an industry. But the technology hadn't quite caught up. Most miners worked deep underground, with nothing but candles, hand tools, and prayer. They inhaled dust, choked on smoke, and risked cave-ins daily. The air was so bad that many developed lung diseases before the age of 30. And yet, mining was one of the more respected blue-collar jobs, because at least it involved metals and fire, the kind of stuff that sounded heroic in a ballad. Then there were the rat catchers. Cities were filthy, waste everywhere, food scraps in the streets, and plenty of rats to go around. These men and women made a living catching vermin with traps, dogs, or their bare hands. Some even carried cages of trained ferrets, which they'd send scurrying into holes to flush the rats out. They were paid by the tail, quite literally. The job was dangerous. Bites could turn septic, and plague was an ever-present shadow. Still, the rat catcher had a strange sort of importance, part pest control, part public savior. And while we're talking about public saviors, let's not forget executioners. probably the most paradoxical job in the medieval world. They were feared, shunned, and sometimes even excommunicated, yet their work was considered necessary, even honorable, by kings and courts. Executioners were professionals, inheriting the job through family lines. They handled everything from hangings to beheadings, and occasionally tortures, though most of them hated that part. Their pay was decent, but their social life, non-existent. Most lived outside town walls, avoided markets, and were forbidden to enter churches. Yet, people would still seek them out privately, to heal wounds or remove boils, because executioners were skilled with blades. It's funny how necessity bends morality when it's convenient. Meanwhile, at the very bottom of the ladder, the beggars and traveling entertainers, often lumped together, tried to survive on whatever scraps of attention or pity they could gather. Minstrels, jesters, and acrobats drifted from town to town, performing for coins. Some were genuinely talented, others were simply desperate. Their audiences ranged from drunk peasants to bored nobles. A noble might reward them with a chicken or a handful of copper pennies, but more often, they were chased out of villages as nuisances. Yet, without these wandering souls, medieval life would have been unbearably grim. They were the ones who brought laughter, or at least distraction, to a world drowning in labor. The funny thing is, while most people today imagine medieval society as neatly divided into nobles, knights, priests, and peasants, the truth was a lot messier. Between those layers existed a web of trades, each one essential, unpleasant, and utterly human. Candlemakers, bakers, millers, coopers, potters, every one of them had their own little corner of suffering. The miller, for instance, was both feared and resented. He controlled the grain supply and took a portion as payment. So yes, he was often accused of cheating, but at least his job didn't involve literal filth. And then, of course, there were the grave diggers. Death was constant in medieval life, and someone had to deal with it. Gravediggers worked through plague years, through wars, through famine. They dug holes in frozen ground, handled bodies that no one else would touch, and often slept near the cemeteries because no one wanted them around. It wasn't glamorous, but in its own way, it was sacred. They were the last hands to hold the dead before the earth claimed them. What ties all these miserable professions together is how necessary they were. Every foul-smelling, back-breaking task kept the grand machinery of medieval society creaking along. The nobles might have held the land, the clergy might have held the prayers, but it was the blacksmiths, gong farmers, leech collectors, and miners who held civilization itself together. They didn't have titles, or comfort, or legacy, but without them, the castles would have collapsed, the cities would have rotted, and the kings would have starved. And even though they lived invisible lives, their fingerprints, sometimes literal, baked into bricks or carved into beams, are still hidden in the corners of surviving medieval structures. You might walk past a centuries-old cathedral today, marveling at its beauty, and never realize that the stone beneath your feet was once hauled, carved, or polished by someone who earned less in a lifetime than you'd spend on coffee in a week. So, by the time we reach the twilight of the medieval era, say the late 1400s into the 1500s, the world had started to shift. But for the working people, for the ones with hands that cracked, bled, and aged before their time, not much really changed. The Renaissance might have been dawning for scholars, merchants, and princes, but down in the muck, someone still had to haul water, tan hides, and empty chamber pots. The same grime, just with fancier art hanging above it. Let's picture it. A bustling medieval street at dusk. Smoke curling out of chimneys, the scent of burnt fat in the air, and a low hum of life echoing between timber-framed buildings. You'd see the candlemaker, hands coated in wax, standing by his workshop door. The tanner would be dragging skins to the riverbank, muttering about the smell that never leaves his clothes. The blacksmith's forge glowed at the edge of town, the rhythmic clang of hammer against iron filling the air like a heartbeat. None of them thought of their lives as medieval or historic. They were just surviving the day, trying to make it to the next, without starving, freezing, or getting the plague. And that's the quiet truth most history books skip. Medieval life wasn't a grand tapestry of kings, knights, and divine destiny. It was thousands of small, grinding existences that made the big stories possible. Every glorious feast, every royal decree, every cathedral spire depended on a mountain of hard, miserable labor. The so-called worst jobs weren't glamorous, but they were the backbone of everything. The blacksmith made the nails that held ships together. The cooper built the barrels that carried ale to armies. The tanner's hides became the armor of men who'd never know his name. If you strip away the myth, what you're left with is strangely comforting. A reminder that history is mostly made by people who never meant to make it. The silent workers who trudged through mud and soot, too busy keeping the world alive to care about legacy. They weren't remembered by chronicles or songs, but their labor built the foundation for everything that came after. Without the gong farmer, the leech collector, the smith, or the miller, there wouldn't have been cities for scholars to write in, or castles for kings to rule from. So, the next time someone paints the medieval age as this golden chivalric fantasy of armor and candles, just remember, behind every knight in shining armor, there was a miner covered in dust. Behind every glittering feast, there was a cook sweating over a smoky fire. Behind every church bell ringing across the fields, there was a blacksmith squinting through sparks, shaping the metal that made it sing. And maybe that's the best way to end our little wander through medieval misery, not with pity, but with perspective. The people who lived those worst jobs were the reason the world didn't fall apart. They were strong, stubborn, and endlessly resourceful. Their stories might be buried beneath centuries of dirt and indifference, but they deserve their place in history, right alongside the kings and conquerors. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine the forge cooling, the tanner finally washing his hands in the stream, the last candle flickering out in the village street. The night wraps around them, quiet and soft. For once, no hammering, no shouting, no shoveling, just stillness. The kind that those who worked hardest rarely got to feel. And that fleeting moment of peace might just be the only luxury they ever truly had.